The morning Ralston lost everything she had ever loved to fire, the sky above the Kansas plains turned the color of an old bruise, purple and sick and beautiful in a way that felt like a cruelty. She had been born Elaine Colby, daughter of a farmer in Missouri, a woman who had grown up understanding that land was not merely property, but something closer to a covenant, a promise between a family and the earth beneath their boots. She had married Thomas Ralston at 22, followed him west in the spring of 1873, and together they had carved something real out of the unforgiving Kansas soil. A homestead, a garden, a future that smelled like wood smoke and cornbread and the particular sweetness of grass after a summer rain. They had a son named Caleb, who was 4 years old and had his father's dark eyes and her own stubborn chin, and they had plans for more children, for more acres, for a life that would expand the way horizons do when you keep riding toward them. Thomas had died of a fever in January of 1876. He had been 31 years old, broad-shouldered and steady, and 1 week he was splitting wood with the ease of a man who expects to be alive forever, and the next he was burning from the inside out, and then he was simply gone. Had buried him herself because the ground was frozen and the nearest neighbor was 6 miles east, and she could not leave Caleb alone long enough to fetch help. She had wrapped Thomas in his good wool blanket and spoken the 23rd Psalm over the mound of cold earth, and then she had gone inside and fed her son his supper and told him that his father had gone to live with the Lord. For 2 years after that, Ralston had survived. She had planted and harvested, had traded eggs and butter at the small settlement of Harrow Creek 5 miles south, had mended fences and patched the roof and done every single thing that 2 people were meant to do because there was simply no one else to do them. She was 26, then 27, then 28. She grew lean and capable and quietly fierce in the way that prairie women do when necessity becomes a kind of armor. And then, in the June of 1878, the fire came. She never knew for certain what started it. Later, she would learn that Denton Price, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had been systematically pushing out small homesteaders to expand his range. He had done it through legal pressure, through intimidation, through the occasional visit from men who rode horses worth more than most families earned in a year. Had refused twice when his representative had come with a cash offer that was insultingly low, and she had been polite but absolute both times, because that land held Thomas's grave, and there was not enough money in the state of Kansas to make her walk away from it. On a Tuesday morning in late June, while had taken Caleb in the wagon to trade at Harrow Creek, a fire started at the dry western edge of her property and moved east with the ruthless efficiency of a Kansas wind behind it. By the time she came home, the farmhouse was a black skeleton. The barn was gone. The vegetable garden was ash. The chicken coop was a collection of charred timbers. Even the well had been fouled with something that turned the water the color of rust. Caleb had started crying when they were still a quarter-mile out and could see the column of smoke staining the sky. Had not cried. She had climbed down from the wagon with the mechanical calm of a person whose mind has not yet caught up with their eyes, had tied the horse to a fence post that was still standing, and had walked slowly toward what remained of the homestead. She had stopped at the edge of the ruin, at the boundary where the burned earth began and the living grass ended, and she had stood there with her empty hands hanging at her sides. Caleb was behind her, holding the hem of her dress, pressing his face against the back of her thigh, sobbing in the way small children do when they understand catastrophe even before they have words for it. Heard him. She kept one hand pressed against the back of his small head, feeling his warmth, and she stared at the ruin of everything she had built, and she thought in a very clear and quiet part of her mind that she did not know what came next. She had $4.30 in her pocket. She had a horse and a wagon. She had a 6-year-old boy and the dress on her back and the bonnet on her head. She had nothing else. The horizon tilted slightly. She did not know if it was the heat from the still smoldering remains or if it was something happening inside her own body, but the world seemed to shift at its edges, and her knees went soft, and she thought, with a distant kind of surprise, that she might be about to fall down in front of her son. And then she heard hooves. Monroe Kendrick had been riding the Harrow Creek Road for 2 days without much particular purpose, which was not unusual for a man in his situation. He was 31 years old, which meant he had been alive long enough to have lost things, and not quite long enough to have stopped hoping he might find something worth keeping. He was a former trail hand, had done the Kishom run 4 times in his 20s, had worked cattle in Texas and horses in Colorado, and had spent 6 months as a deputy in a town in New Mexico that no longer existed because a flash flood had taken it in 1875. He was not a drifter in the sorry sense of the word. He had money saved, enough to buy into something if the right something came along, but he had not yet found the particular patch of earth that felt like his. So he rode, he looked, he thought. He had stopped in Harrow Creek the previous afternoon to water his horse, a big black gelding named Tar, and the woman behind the counter of the general store had mentioned, in the offhand way of people who live in small places where everyone's business is common knowledge, that the Ralston widow out on the old Miller Road might be having trouble with Denton Price's men again. Monroe had not asked any follow-up questions because it was not his business, but the word widow and the word trouble had lodged together in his mind the way certain things do, like a splinter too deep to reach but not deep enough to ignore. He had camped outside of town and ridden out in the morning, telling himself he was simply taking the Miller Road because it cut north toward Wichita, which was vaguely in the direction he was vaguely heading. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. He smelled the smoke before he saw it. Tar smelled it too and started sidestepping with that particular nervous energy horses have when fire is anywhere in their world. Monroe spoke to him low and steady, and they came over a slight rise in the road, and the burned homestead opened up before him like a wound in the landscape. He saw her immediately. A woman standing at the edge of the ruin, perfectly still, her dark hair escaping her bonnet in the wind, and a small boy pressed against her back. Something about the stillness of her stopped his breath. She was not moving, not crying, not calling out. She was simply standing there with her hands at her sides, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that told him she was holding herself upright through an act of will that was just barely succeeding. He rode up at a canter, pulled Tar to a stop 10 feet away, and swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully settled. "Ma'am," he said. She turned her head. Her face was the kind of face that had been beautiful before grief had cut everything down to the bone, strong cheekbones, dark eyes that were dry and very wide, a mouth pressed into a line so straight it looked like a seam holding something shut. There was soot on her cheek from God knows when, and she was gripping her own skirt with one hand in a way that told him her knees were not entirely cooperating. "Ma'am," he said again, and stepped forward and put his hand under her elbow because she was swaying, just slightly, and he was not going to stand 10 feet away and watch a woman fall down in front of her crying child. Her arm was thin but solid with muscle, the arm of someone who had been working too hard for too long. She stiffened when he touched her, the instinct of a person who had been alone and self-sufficient long enough to find contact almost startling. "I am fine," she said. Her voice was even and low and completely unconvincing. "No, ma'am," Monroe said, simply and without any unkindness. "I don't believe you are, but that's all right. You don't have to be right now." She looked at him for a long moment, as if she were assessing him the way a person assesses a bridge before deciding whether to trust their weight to it. He let her look. He had an honest face. He knew this because people told him so, not as a compliment but as a simple statement of observable facts, square-jawed, and weathered with pale gray eyes that his mother had always said looked like the sky before snow. "Who are you?" she asked. "Monroe Kendrick," he said. "I've got no particular business here except that I was riding past and I think you need help and I'd like to offer it. My word on that." She looked down at the small boy, who had stopped crying and was now staring up at Monroe with the suspicious, red-eyed scrutiny of a child who has been hurt and is deciding whether to be scared of a stranger. "This is Caleb," she said. "I am me Ralston." "Hello, Caleb," Monroe said, and crouched down to be eye level with the boy because he had learned a long time ago that you never looked down at a child if you wanted them to trust you. "That's a good strong name." Caleb wiped his nose on his sleeve and said, "Our house burned up." "I can see that," Monroe said. "I'm sorry about that. That's a terrible thing." Caleb seemed to find this answer acceptable in its straightforwardness. He nodded once with a gravity that was too old for his 6 years. Monroe stood back up and looked at me. The sun was moving past noon and the heat of the burned ground was still considerable, and she had a child and nowhere to go. "Is there family?" he asked. "My sister is in Abilene," me said. "Thomas's people are in Tennessee." "Harrow Creek," he said. She shook her head, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "I owe the Harrow Creek store for spring seed. I'm not going to walk in there with my hat in my hand." He almost smiled at that, because it was such a precise and particular kind of pride. Not the foolish pride that refuses all help, but the pride of a person who has been managing alone long enough that the idea of presenting themselves as a charity case to people they do business with was genuinely intolerable. "What about your horse?" he said, nodding toward the roan mare still tied to the surviving fence post. "It's mine," me said. "And the wagon." "Then here's what I think," Monroe said. He was not a man who talked around things, which some people found abrupt and other people found like a drink of cold water. "I think we get you and Caleb up in that wagon. I think we go to Harrow Creek and I'll pay your account at the store, and then you can write to your sister in Abilene and figure out your next step from there. And before you tell me you won't accept it, I want you to know I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a loan, if that makes it easier to take." Me Ralston looked at him for such a long time that he wondered if he'd said something wrong. The wind moved through the grass around the burned ground and ruffled the edge of her bonnet. Caleb had put his hand into Monroe's without anyone deciding that was going to happen, just reaching up and taking hold of Monroe's fingers in the unconscious way young children have of anchoring themselves to whatever seems solid. Monroe felt the small weight of that hand and did not move. "Why?" me said finally. It was a fair question. He thought about it honestly. "Because somebody should," he said. "And I'm here." She nodded once slowly, as if she were filing that answer away somewhere. Then she turned and called to Caleb to come with her to the wagon, and she began walking toward it with her spine straight and her chin level, and Monroe watched her and thought that he had never in his life seen anyone hold themselves together so deliberately. They came into Harrow Creek in the late afternoon, me driving her wagon and Monroe riding alongside, and the small settlement of perhaps 40 souls spread along a single main road regarded them with the discreet but total attention that small towns give to anything unusual. Monroe tied tar to the rail in front of Gatlin's General Store and paid the seed debt. It came to $1.80, which me wrote down on a piece of paper that she folded and put in her pocket. And then he helped Caleb down from the wagon seat, and the three of them stood in the street trying to figure out what came next. The one boarding house in Harrow Creek was a 2-room operation run by a woman named Harriet Foss, who was somewhere between 50 and 70, depending on whether she'd had a good year or a bad one. She had 3 teeth she was proud of and a sharp, practical mind, and when Monroe explained the situation to her, the burned homestead, the widow, the child, she clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth and told me she could have the back room for half price until she sorted herself out. "I'll take the barn," Monroe said. Harriet looked at him with the frank, appraising look of a woman who has seen every variety of man ride through a town and has developed definitive opinions about most of them. "You're welcome to it," she said, 2 cents a night. That evening, Harriet fed them all at her kitchen table. A simple meal of salt pork and beans and cornbread, and Caleb ate with the wholehearted focus of a hungry child, and then fell asleep in his chair before the meal was fully finished. Monroe lifted him and carried him to the back room and set him on the narrow bed while Me pulled off the boy's boots, and for a moment they were both bent over the sleeping child in the small lamplight, and the domesticity of it was so sudden and so unexpected that both of them straightened up quickly and looked away. "I'll write to my sister tonight," Me said, in the hallway outside the room. "That's a good plan," Monroe said. "How long are you planning to stay in Harrow Creek?" she asked, and then seemed surprised that she had asked it, as if the question had gotten out before she could stop it. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. She nodded and went inside and closed the door softly. Monroe lay in Harriet's barn on a pile of clean hay with tar moving quietly in the stall nearby, and he stared at the dark ceiling and thought about Ralston's face when she had turned to look at him at the edge of her burned homestead, that precise moment when she had been about to fall and had not let herself, and he was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. The next morning, Monroe rode out to the Ralston homestead alone. He told himself this was because he wanted to get a better sense of what had happened, and that was true as far as it went. What he found when he got there confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. The fire had not started from a cookstove or a lantern or any of the ordinary domestic accidents that took farms in the summer. It had started in two places simultaneously. He could see the char patterns from the edge of the property, which meant it had been deliberately set, and set by someone who wanted it to look accidental but had not been particularly careful about it. He also found, just inside the edge of the property where the burning had not quite reached, the corner post of Thomas Ralston's grave marker. It was a simple thing, two pieces of wood nailed together with the name carved with a knife rather than proper tools. Thomas James Ralston, 1845–1876. Monroe stood at the grave for a moment with his hat in his hands and looked at the marker and thought about the woman who had made it. He rode back to Harrow Creek by way of the Price cattle operation, not stopping, just riding past close enough to see the scale of it. The Price ranch sprawled across a considerable piece of the county, the kind of operation that had been built up by buying out or squeezing out anyone who held land in its path. He had seen the type before, in Texas and in the territories. The Homestead Acts had given ordinary people the theoretical right to claim land, but the reality was that men with money and power and the right connections could make those claims evaporate when they decided they needed the land more than the homesteader did. He did not stop at the Price Ranch. He rode back to town. Me was in the street when he returned, standing outside the general store with Caleb at her side, talking to a man Monroe didn't know. As Monroe pulled Tar up and dismounted, the man middle-aged, well-dressed by frontier standards with the slightly oiled quality of someone who spent more time talking than working, tipped his hat to me and walked away. "Who was that?" Monroe asked. "Price's man," Me said. "His name is Gibbon. He came to offer me money for the land." She paused. "More money than before." Monroe looked down the street where the man had gone. "How much more?" "Enough that it's supposed to sound reasonable," Me said. $200 for 35 acres. She said it with a flatness that made clear what she thought of the reasonableness of it. "Are you going to take it?" She looked at him sharply, as if she were deciding whether to be offended by the question, and then the sharpness softened slightly. "Thomas is buried on that land," she said. "I know," Monroe said. "I rode out there this morning." Something shifted in her expression. "Why did you do that?" "Because I wanted to know what happened," he said, "and because I think someone should know." She was quiet for a moment. "Gibbon told me the fire started from a lantern I must have left burning." He said it with a smile that meant he was lying, and wanted me to know he was lying, and wanted me to understand that there was nothing I could do about it. Monroe felt something tighten in his chest, not anger exactly, but something close to it. "He may be right that there's not much to be done in the legal sense," he said carefully. "A man like Price has arrangements with most of the county officials." "I know," Me said. "I've known men like Price my whole life. They build walls and then smile at you from the other side of them." Caleb had been listening to this exchange with the fixed attention of a child who understands more than adults assume. He pulled at me's skirt and said, "Mama, are we going to Aunt Clara's?" "I'm waiting for a letter back," me told him gently. "We'll know soon." But the letter from Clara Colby, when it came 4 days later, carried news that changed the shape of everything. Clara wrote that she was herself in a difficult situation. Her husband had lost his job at the stockyards in Abilene, and they were barely managing with their own 3 children. She wrote it with evident shame and genuine sorrow, and she told me she was sorry, that she wished things were different, and that she prayed me would find her way through. Me read the letter sitting at Harriet Foss's kitchen table, while Harriet pretended to be very busy with something on the other side of the room, and Monroe sat across the table and watched me's face as she read. When she set the letter down, she looked up and met his eyes, and there was no self-pity in her expression, only the steady, pragmatic assessment of someone recalculating their situation. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "I have $4 and some cents," she said. "I have a horse and a wagon that I cannot afford to feed for long. I have no home. I have a son." She paused. "I can take Price's money and go somewhere, or I can try to rebuild." "What does rebuilding look like?" Monroe asked. "It looks like more than I have," she said simply. Monroe turned his hat over in his hands. He had been doing a great deal of thinking over the past 4 days, the kind of thinking that arrives sideways at a destination that the direct route never would have found. He had eaten supper at Harriet's table with me and Caleb every night since they'd arrived. He had helped Caleb with a loose wagon wheel bolt one morning and taught him how to tie a proper hitch, not another. He had ridden out to the burned homestead twice more, once to retrieve Thomas Ralston's grave marker from the edge of the ruin, which he had brought back and propped carefully against the wall of Harriet's barn without saying anything to me about it. He had been thinking about the 35 acres of Kansas land, which, if the descriptions in the county records were accurate, was good grass land sitting on a modest rise with its own water source. He had been thinking about the $540 he had saved and kept in a leather pouch sewn into the lining of his saddlebag. He had been thinking about me Ralston's hands and her voice and the way she looked at Caleb and the way she had stood at the edge of the ruin with her spine straight and her knees barely holding. "I want to propose something," he said, "and I want you to hear it out before you answer." She folded her hands on the table and waited, giving him her full attention in the way she gave everything her full attention, which was to say completely. "I have money saved," he said. "Enough to buy materials to rebuild. I know how to build. I've put up more structures than I can count, barns and houses and fences, in Texas and Colorado and New Mexico. I know the land here is good. I know that Price sent a man to burn your place, which means he wants the land badly enough to commit a crime for it, and if he wants it that bad, then it's worth keeping." He stopped. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm saying that I would like to invest in rebuilding the Ralston homestead, if you would permit it, and we would work that land together and split the proceeds. And that is a business arrangement and nothing more, unless you should ever decide it might be something else. And if you decide it never will be something else, then eventually when the property is rebuilt and profitable, I walk away with my investment and you have your home back." The kitchen was very quiet. Harriet had stopped pretending to be busy and was making no attempt to conceal the fact that she was listening. Me looked at Monroe for a long time with those dark eyes that had already taken his measure and filed away the results. He had the sensation of being appraised not just as a man, but as an idea, as a proposition, as a variable in an equation she was working out. "You said unless I decided it might be something else," she said carefully. "I did say that. What would make you think I might ever decide that?" He looked at her across the table, at the soot that had been on her cheek on the first day but was gone now, at the careful dignity with which she sat, and the particular way the lamplight fell on the curve of her jaw. "I don't know if you would," he said honestly. "I just wanted to make sure you knew the possibility existed from my side, so that you could make a fair decision." She was quiet for such a long time that Monroe began to think he had badly miscalculated the whole thing, Then she said, "My husband has been gone 2.5 years." "I know," Monroe said, "and I'm not asking you to forget him. I would never ask that." "He was a good man," she said, and there was a particular quality to the way she said it, not grief, exactly, or not only grief, but something that sounded like she was making a statement of record. "He built something from nothing, and he loved Caleb, and he was always square with me." "Then he deserves the land he chose," Monroe said quietly. She looked down at her folded hands and then back up at him, and the thing in her face was not quite a decision yet, but it was closer to one than it had been a moment before. "All right," she said. "As a business arrangement, you have my word I'll be fair about the investment and I will keep honest accounts." "I never doubted that," Monroe said. They started work the following Monday. Monroe bought lumber at the yard in Harrow Creek and arranged to have it hauled out to the Homestead property. And he and me worked from first light to last light every day. And Caleb worked beside them with the uncomplaining seriousness of a child who has learned early that work is simply what people do. They started with the well, because clean water was the first necessity. Monroe spent the better part of 2 days down in the shaft, clearing the debris and whatever had been poured into it. The source of the rust color turned out to be a quantity of copper oxide, which made Monroe's jaw tighten because that was not accidental and not cheap. And then they lined the inside with new stone and covered it properly. The barn went up next because the horse needed shelter and tools needed storage. Monroe knew timber framing, and he worked with the methodical confidence of someone for whom physical construction was a language, and me worked beside him without complaint, hauling boards and holding joints and driving nails with a precision that told him this was not the first time she had done it. They were efficient together in the way that people are when their competencies complement each other without overlapping too much. He knew the structural elements, the load-bearing logic of beams and posts, and she knew the property's particular qualities, the way the prevailing wind came from the northwest, and how the ground went soft near the eastern fence line after rain, and where the previous garden had drawn the best light. In the evenings, they sat on the half-built frame of what would become the porch and ate whatever could be cooked over a campfire, and Caleb fell asleep between them often enough that it became a kind of routine, the boy going limp against Monroe's side or against his mother's knee, with the easy, unconscious trust of a child who feels safe. Monroe told me about the Kisham Run, about the particular loneliness of driving cattle north across hundreds of miles of grass, with nothing for company but other trail hands and the sound of the herd. Me told Monroe about her father's farm in Missouri, about learning to read in a one-room schoolhouse from a teacher who had only 3 books but believed in them with a conviction that more than compensated for the shortage. She told him about meeting Thomas Ralston at a church social when she was 20, about the courtship that had been brief and direct, because both of them were practical people who recognized what they saw. "Were you happy?" Monroe asked one evening, not intrusively, just the way you ask things in the dark when the fire has burned low and the stars are very present. "Yes," me said, without hesitation. "We were different kinds of happy than I think some people are. We were not a dramatic sort of happiness. It was steady, like a lamp that doesn't flicker." She paused. "When he died, the steadiness went. I've been managing without it, but it's not the same thing as having it." Monroe was quiet, turning that over. "What about you?" me asked, and he could hear in her voice that she was returning the question as a kind of fair exchange, not from idle curiosity but from the genuine interest of someone who had decided to know a person. "I've been looking for something to be steady about," he said. "I thought I'd know it when I found it. I've been wrong about that a few times." "Wrong how?" she asked. "There was a woman in San Antonio," he said, 4 years ago. I thought I was going to settle there." She disagreed. He said it without self-pity, the plain statement of a thing that had happened. "And before that I thought the trail work was enough, that moving was its own kind of life. But it isn't, or it isn't for me. You need a place, I think. You need somewhere that knows you." Me looked at him sideways in the firelight. "Kansas knows you now," she said. whether you planned on it or not." He turned to look at her, and she was already looking away, out at the dark plain, and the firelight was on the side of her face, and she was half smiling at something she hadn't quite said. He did not say anything back, but he felt the warmth of the moment settle into him and stay there. The house frame went up in the 3rd week, and the walls followed in the 4th, and by the end of the 2nd month they had a house with a proper roof and a sound floor and glass windows that Monroe had driven to Harrow Creek twice to haul back in careful straw-padded crates. It was not a large house, 2 rooms downstairs, a sleeping loft above, but it was well made, made with the kind of attention that happens when people care about the result. On the day they moved in, such as moving in consisted of, given that they had almost no furniture, only what Monroe had purchased from Harriet Foss, and from the general store, Caleb ran from room to room examining everything with the thoroughness of a property inspector, and then came back to where Monroe and me stood in the main room and said, with great seriousness, "It's better than before." Monroe laughed. Me put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes were bright in a way that might have been laughter and might have been something else, and he chose not to look too closely, because he thought she might not want him to see it. That night, with Caleb asleep in the loft above, Monroe sat outside on the new porch and listened to the Kansas night, the immense uninterrupted quiet of the plain broken only by insect sound and somewhere distant a coyote, and me came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him and handed him one without asking whether he wanted it. "Monroe," she said. "Me," he said. They were quiet together for a while, and the quiet was the comfortable kind, not the uncomfortable kind, and that itself seemed like information. "I need to tell you something," me said. "All right," he said. "I have been trying very hard to think of you only as a business partner," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it because I don't think I'm the kind of woman who falls easily, and I don't think I should be, and I believe there's wisdom in going slowly." "I agree with all of that," Monroe said carefully. "But I'm also an honest woman," she said, "and I think honesty requires me to tell you that the trying has been getting harder." He turned to look at her. She was looking straight out at the dark plain, her cup held in both hands, her face very composed. He could see the pulse at the side of her throat. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and in the dark her eyes were very dark, and there was a wariness in them still, the wariness of someone who had been burned as thoroughly as a homestead and was not in a hurry to trust a new structure. But behind the wariness there was something else, something that was paying attention. "Don't rush me," she said. "Me," he said. "I have been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for. I can wait a good deal longer now that I know." She turned back to the dark, and he saw the corner of her mouth move, and she took a slow breath, and they sat together in the quiet and drank their coffee as the stars moved overhead, and Monroe Kendrick thought that he had never been anywhere that felt more like a place that knew him. The trouble with Price came back before the harvest. It arrived one August morning in the form of 2 men on good horses who rode up to the Homestead fence and called out for me, Ralston. And when she came to the door with Monroe beside her, they announced that Denton Price was asserting a water rights claim on the eastern portion of the property that he said predated the Ralston homestead claim by 2 years. Monroe knew this kind of claim. He had seen it before. It was the sort of legal mechanism that men with money used to tie up small holders in county court proceedings that cost money and time that the small holder didn't have, grinding them down through paperwork rather than fire this time. It was, in its way, more elegant than burning a house down, and more insulting because it dressed itself in the language of law. He said nothing while the men delivered the message. Me said nothing either. She listened with her hands folded in front of her and her face perfectly still, and when the men had finished she said, "Thank you, I will look into it," in a tone of such complete calm dismissal that both men seemed slightly uncertain about whether they had done their job properly. When they had ridden away, me turned to Monroe and said, "Can he do this?" "He can try," Monroe said. but a 2-year predated water claim on land that's been in the county records as homesteaded for 5 years is not nothing to challenge. I want to go to Wichita and talk to a lawyer. Me looked at him. That will cost money. It will, he said. I have it. Monroe, she said, this is my fight. It is, he agreed. And I'm choosing to be in it with you, which is a different thing from it being my fight. Will you let me help? She held his gaze for a moment with that measuring look he had come to know well, the one that was taking the full measure of everything and rendering a fair verdict, and then she said, "Yes, thank you." He rode to Wichita the following week and spent 2 days with a lawyer named Aldrich Crane, a former Ohio man who had come west for his lungs and stayed, because he found the legal chaos of the frontier more interesting than anything he had left behind. Crane was a thin, precise man with spectacles and an impressive command of the Kansas property statutes, and when Monroe laid out the situation he listened without interruption and then said flatly that Price's water rights claim was fabricated. "The county records are clear," Crane said. "The original Homestead claim was filed and recorded properly in 1873 under Thomas Ralston's name and transferred to me, Ralston, by right of survivorship upon his death in 1876. The water source on the eastern boundary is expressly included in the property description. Price can file his claim in county court, but he will lose." He paused, assuming the county judge is not in his pocket. Monroe had thought about this. "What's Judge Harmon's reputation?" he asked. Harmon was the county judge in the district where the Ralston homestead sat. Crane considered. "Harmon is a fair man," he said. "He's not bought. I know this because Price tried to buy him 3 years ago and Harmon threw the man's representative out of his office." Monroe left Wichita with a letter from Crane outlining the specific statutory basis on which Price's claim would fail, and he rode back to the homestead, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the specific pleasure of a problem that has a solution. He arrived back on a Friday evening to find me and Caleb in the garden, which had been replanted, and was coming in with the determined vigor of things that have survived being burned. Caleb was carrying a bucket and watering the bean rows with the focused gravity he brought to everything, and me was kneeling in the dark earth checking the roots of the tomato plants. She looked up when Monroe rode in, and there was something in her face that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, and he thought it was possible she had worried about whether he would come back, and that thought lodged in him somewhere deep and warm. "Crane says we'll win," Monroe told her. She sat back on her heels in the garden, and she closed her eyes for a moment, and he watched some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Tell me," she said. He sat down on the fence post, and he told her everything, every detail of what Crane had said, because she deserved every detail, and because he had noticed early on that she did not like to be given summaries when there were specifics available. She listened with her hands in her lap and the garden dirt on her wrists and the evening light golden on her face, and when he was finished she said, "I want to write to Crane myself." "I told him you would," Monroe said. She looked at him with an expression that was half surprised and half something warmer. "You told him that?" "I know you," he said. The warmth in her face was slow and quiet, like light coming through a window rather than through an open door, and it did more to Monroe Kendrick than 100 more dramatic things might have. The hearing at the county court in Harrow Creek took place in September, in the small frame building that served as both courthouse and town meeting hall. Denton Price attended in person, a large, red-faced man in his late 50s, who wore his prosperity in the visible way of men who believe money speaks loudest when it's displayed, and he brought 2 lawyers and 3 witnesses. Me attended with Monroe at her side and Aldrich Crane's letter in her hand, and she sat in the front row with a straightness that Monroe had come to think of as her particular signature, the posture of a woman who had decided to be solid when everything around her tried to make her less. Judge Harmon was indeed not in Price's pocket. He read Crane's letter and the original homestead filings and Price's water rights claim with equal care, and at the end of an hour of proceedings, he ruled against Price's claim on 3 separate statutory grounds, and he additionally noted in the record, with what appeared to be deliberate clarity, that the pattern of attempts to acquire the Ralston property by various means was one that the court found notable. It was not a prosecution. It was not a punishment. But it was a statement of record, and in a county where Price's influence depended in part on the assumption that no one would challenge him, it meant something. Price left the courthouse without speaking to anyone, and his lawyer had the tight-jawed look of a man who had expected an easier morning. Outside the courthouse, Mee stood in the September sunlight, and she was very still for a moment, and then she turned to Monroe and she did something she had not done before, which was to reach out and take his hand. It was a brief thing. Her fingers closed around his for a moment, warm and calloused and deliberate, and then she let go. But Monroe felt it in his chest like a key turning in a lock. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," he said. "You stayed, you kept the land, that was you." "I didn't do it alone," she said, and she said it looking directly at him in that direct way of hers, not letting him deflect the thing she was saying. Caleb appeared between them, having escaped Harriet Foss's supervision somewhere in the proceeding, and took one of each of their hands with the cheerful decisiveness of a child who sees no reason why this should not be perfectly natural, and they walked together down the dirt street of Harrow Creek toward Harriet's boarding house for dinner. October came in golden and enormous the way Kansas Octobers do, the sky a deeper blue than any other time of year, and the grass going amber and the air carrying that particular cold edge that reminds you winter is not an abstract concern, but a specific and approaching fact. The harvest was modest. They had planted late in a disrupted year, but the corn came in and the kitchen garden had produced enough that Mee had jars lined up along the kitchen shelf in orderly rows, each one a small proof of continuity. Monroe had been sleeping in the barn since the house was rebuilt, the same arrangement they had started with at Harriet Foss's, but increasingly it felt like a convention rather than a necessity, and the distance between the barn and the house had taken on a particular character that both of them were aware of and neither of them had directly addressed. One afternoon in mid-October, Monroe was mending the fence along the north boundary of the property when he became aware that someone had stopped on the road and was watching him. He straightened up and turned and found a man sitting on a brown horse at the edge of the road, not Price's men, not anyone he recognized, just a traveling man with a lean face and the look of someone who has been on the road a good while. "Kendrick," the man said. Monroe shielded his eyes. "I know you." "Harley Doone," the man said, and Monroe looked again and then did know him, a former trail hand from the Kishom days, a decade ago, a decent man Monroe had not thought about in years. "Heard you'd stopped somewhere. Didn't believe it till I saw it." Monroe laughed, genuinely surprised. "Get down, Harley. I'll get you water and something to eat." Harley Doone stayed for supper, which meant he stayed at the kitchen table while Mee cooked and Monroe fed the animals, and Caleb told Harley with enormous enthusiasm about the time Monroe had taught him to whistle. Harley Doone ate with the gratitude of a man who had been on the road a long time, and told road stories and watched Monroe and Mee move around each other in the kitchen, with the look of a man who was watching something very clear being communicated in a language he was not supposed to understand. After supper, while Mee was putting Caleb to bed upstairs, Harley Doone sat on the porch with Monroe and smoked his pipe and said without preamble, "You're a fool if you don't marry that woman." Monroe considered the porch boards. "That's between me and me," he said. "Sure it is," Harley said amiably. "I'm just pointing out that I have ridden the Kishom Trail 4 times and the Good Night Loving once, and I have been to every territory between here and California, and I have never once in that entire time seen you look at anything the way you look at her." He took a drag on his pipe. "Not horses, not sunsets, not money. Nothing." Monroe said nothing, which was a kind of answer. "She feels the same way," Harley said. "I don't know the woman, but I have eyes." "It's complicated," Monroe said. "It never is," Harley said. "People just make it that way." Harley Doon left the next morning, heading north toward Nebraska, and Monroe shook his hand and watched him go and then stood in the yard for a long time after the road had swallowed him, thinking about what was complicated and what was simply fear dressed up as complication. Me found him standing there. Who was he? She asked. An old friend, Monroe said. A man who says what he thinks. She came and stood beside him in the yard, close enough that their arms were almost touching. The morning was cold and bright, and the land rolled out before them in its autumn colors, and the house was behind them with smoke coming from the chimney, and Caleb's voice was audible from inside, talking to himself in the way children do. "Monroe," me said. "Me," he said. She turned to face him, and he turned to face her, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that had taken his full measure months ago, and arrived at a conclusion they had both been walking around since then. The wind moved her hair across her cheek, and she did not push it away. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said that first night at Harriet's, about the possibility existing from your side." "I remember," he said. "I have been thinking that I'm done trying not to feel the things I feel," she said. "I've been sensible and I've been careful and I have been very adult about all of it, and I think it's time to stop." She paused. "Caleb calls you Monroe. He has been calling you Monroe since the third day. I don't think he's confused about anything." Monroe felt the tightness in his chest that had been there for months release in a single long breath. "He's a perceptive kid," he said. "He is," she said. "He has his father's eyes, and, apparently, my terrible habit of knowing exactly what I'm looking at before I admit it." Monroe reached out slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and put his hand against her face, his thumb brushing the cheekbone that the firelight had touched 100 evenings. She did not pull away. She turned her face slightly into his hand like something coming toward warmth. "Me Ralston," he said. "I think I have been riding toward you my whole life without knowing your name." "Monroe Kendrick," she said. "I think you had better stop riding and stay." He kissed her then, there in the October yard with the smell of autumn grass and wood smoke around them, and Kansas spread out in every direction as far as the eye could reach. And it was the kind of kiss that feels less like a beginning than like the resolution of something that should have happened a while ago, warm and certain and unhurried. The kiss of two people who have already done the hardest work together and arrived at this as its natural and right destination. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind them and said, "Are you kissing?" with the tone of someone who finds this simultaneously obvious and mildly interesting. They stepped apart, both of them laughing. Monroe crouched down to Caleb's level and said, "We were." Caleb regarded this seriously for a moment. "Okay," he said, and went back inside. "Monroe proposed to me on a Sunday morning in November, in the kitchen, without ceremony or decoration, simply because it was what was true and he saw no reason to dress it up in anything it didn't need. He said that he loved her and that he wanted to build his life with her, and that he would spend every day that followed being worthy of the trust she placed in him. And he said it sitting across the kitchen table from her with his hat in his hands and no artifice about it." Me said yes without a moment of hesitation, and she came around the table and put her arms around him in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the new glass windows, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, and he held her and thought that this was what steady felt like, this specific and permanent warmth. They were married in December, in Harrow Creek's small church, on a cold, bright day when the sky was the hard, clear blue of deep winter. Harriet Foss cried through the entire ceremony with the uninhibited emotional thoroughness of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome since the first day she had seen them at her kitchen table. Caleb stood beside Monroe as a sort of honorary witness, wearing his best shirt and a very serious expression, and when the minister pronounced them married, Caleb said, "Good," loudly enough that the small congregation laughed. The winter that followed was the best winter of Monroe Kendrick's life, and he thought this without qualification or reservation. They were snowbound for 10 days in January, the kind of prairie blizzard that makes the world go white and silent and reduces everything to the interior of a warm house. And they passed those 10 days in the particular intimacy of two people who are still discovering each other and have been given the gift of unlimited time to do it. They talked for hours, long conversations about everything, about faith and the lack of it, about what Kansas would look like in 20 years, about whether Caleb might go to a proper school in Wichita eventually, about what Monroe's mother had been like and what Me's father had meant to her, and what Thomas had been like in the small daily details that biographies don't capture. Monroe learned that Me read voraciously and had managed, over the years of the homestead, to accumulate 7 books which had survived the fire only because they had been in a box in the wagon that day. He went through all 7 of them over the winter, partly because there was pleasure in them and partly because he liked being able to discuss them with her. He learned that she could do arithmetic in her head faster than he could on paper. He learned that she sang to herself while she worked, not consciously, just as a kind of ambient sound, and the sound was very good. Me learned that Monroe woke before dawn every morning regardless of season, as if his body had been calibrated to some private standard, and that he went to sleep later than anyone she had ever known, and that in between he was present and attentive in a way she had not expected from a man who had spent so many years moving. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that took a moment to recognize, and that she found more satisfying than the obvious kind. She learned that he was gentle with Caleb in a way that was neither forced nor performed, the natural, easy gentleness of someone who simply liked the boy. One evening in February she found Monroe in the lamplight reading to Caleb from one of her books. It was a collection of poems, which she would not have guessed Monroe would choose. And Caleb was asleep against his side, and Monroe was still reading quietly, not having stopped just because the audience was unconscious, and she stood in the doorway and watched for a long moment before he noticed her, and she thought that if this was what the rest of her life looked like, she would consider that a very good life indeed. Spring came with the particular force it always has on the prairie, as if the earth is making a deliberate argument after the silence of winter. Monroe and Me planted the south fields in corn, and the kitchen garden in everything. Me had decided to try tomatoes, beans, squash, and a row of sunflowers along the east fence that she planted purely because she wanted them, which Monroe thought was exactly the right reason to plant anything. Me Ralston, Me Kendrick now, though she kept both names in her own mind, believing a woman was entitled to carry all the names she had earned, was expecting their first child by April, which she told Monroe on a Tuesday morning in the kind of straight, direct way she told him everything, watching his face. His face did what faces do when something moves through them that is too large for a controlled response. He sat down on the bench by the kitchen table and he put his hands on her waist and he pressed his forehead against her middle, very gently, and Me put her hands on the back of his head, and they stayed like that for a moment in the morning kitchen. "Caleb is going to have opinions about this," she said. They told Caleb that evening. Caleb did indeed have opinions, which were largely centered on the question of whether the baby would be old enough to play games when it arrived, and when Me explained that new babies were not immediately useful for games, Caleb considered this and said, "That's all right, I'll teach it things." Monroe looked at Me over the top of Caleb's head, and the look was full of everything the story of them had become. The summer of 1879 was a good one. The corn came in well. Harrow Creek had grown by 8 new families since the previous year, the steady westward settling that was changing the shape of the territory, and Monroe had taken on a part-time arrangement with the Harrow Creek livery stable, breaking horses, because it was work he was good at, and the income was useful during the build years. Me had developed a butter and egg trade with 2 new families, and with Harriet Foss, who ran a steady business in breakfast at the boarding house, and the income from that was hers, and she kept the accounts herself in a ledger with the meticulous care of someone who had learned the specific cost of financial uncertainty. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the light change over the plain, and sometimes Caleb was with them, and sometimes he was inside already asleep. And Monroe would put his arm around me and she would settle against his side, and they would watch the stars come out in the particular way of the prairie, all at once and everywhere, and they would talk or they would not talk, and both were equally good. Me's sister Clara came in July with her 3 children and her chastened husband Samuel, who had found work again with a freight company and was trying to rebuild his own situation. It was crowded and occasionally complicated and altogether wonderful, the house full of children and voices and the particular energy of a family expanding beyond its core. Clara cried when she saw me, holding her sister by the shoulders and looking at her and saying, "You look like you're happy," with a kind of wondering relief. "I am," me said simply. Clara liked Monroe immediately, which she conveyed by talking to him for 3 hours about everything imaginable, and testing every answer he gave with the frank, suspicious love of a woman who has been worried about her sister. Monroe submitted to this with good humor and answered every question directly, and by the end of it Clara had apparently reached a verdict, because she pulled me into the kitchen and said, in a whisper that was not very quiet, "He's the real thing, me." "I know," me said. "How did you know?" Clara asked. Me thought about it. "He rode up when I was about to fall down," she said, "and he's been beside me ever since." In August, the Ralston Price water rights case came up one final time when Price attempted to file an appeal through the district court in Wichita. Aldrich Crane handled it with the confident efficiency of a lawyer who has a clearly winning argument and knows it, and the appeal was denied in a single session. Denton Price, Monroe heard through Harrow Creek gossip, had turned his expansion attention northward toward the territories, which meant he was likely making life difficult for someone else, but at least he was done with the Kendrick land. Monroe stood at Thomas Ralston's grave on the afternoon he heard the news. He had maintained the grave with a consistent care since the beginning, keeping the marker upright and the ground around it clear, because he understood without anyone telling him that honoring the man who had come before him was not a threat to anything but in fact the right thing to do. He stood with his hat in his hands and he said, quietly, "The land is safe. She's all right. Caleb is all right. I'll take care of them." The wind moved through the grass, and the September sun was long and golden, and Monroe put his hat back on and walked back to the house. Me's labor began on a cold, clear night in late September, and it was Monroe who rode to fetch the midwife from Harrow Creek, a competent woman named Elva Marsh, and when he came back with Elva, he sat outside on the porch with Caleb, who had been woken by the activity and refused to go back to sleep, and together they waited through the night with a lamp between them. Caleb fell asleep against Monroe's arm around midnight. Monroe held him and listened to the sounds of the house and the sounds of the night and the sounds of the land that was now his land, that he had made with his own hands and with Me's hands, and he felt the weight of the boy and the warmth of it, and he thought that the world was very full. Just before dawn, Elva Marsh opened the door and said, "You have a boy. Both are well." Monroe carried Caleb inside and set him down on the lower bunk, and then went to the bedroom doorway where Me was in the bed, exhausted and luminous in the way that women are after they have done the tremendous work, and she was holding a red-faced, squinting infant who was already objecting loudly to the circumstances of his arrival. "Come here," Me said. Monroe sat on the edge of the bed, and Me put the baby into his arms with the casual trust of a woman who knows exactly who she is giving her child to. And Monroe held his son, a concept that was too large to fit inside his chest all at once, and the baby stopped crying, going still in the way newborns do when they are held correctly, and Monroe looked at the small face and felt something shift permanently in himself, a rearrangement of everything that had ever been uncertain. "What do you want to name him?" Me asked. Monroe thought about it. "James," he said and looked at her. "Thomas James Ralston." James, for the middle name of the man buried on the east edge of their land, the good man who had built something from nothing and loved this family before Monroe had arrived to be part of it. Me looked at him with those dark eyes, and she reached up and touched his face with her fingers. "James," she said. "Yes." Caleb appeared in the doorway, having been woken by the baby's earlier crying, and apparently followed Monroe to the bedroom. He stood in his nightshirt and looked at the baby in Monroe's arms with an expression of intense critical assessment. "He's very small," Caleb said. "He is," Monroe agreed. "He'll get bigger." "Will he know how to ride?" "Not for a while," Monroe said. Caleb nodded, processing this timeline. "I'll wait," he said. They named him James Monroe Kendrick, and me noted the second name with a look that said she found it presumptuous and also secretly pleased her. And Monroe said it was purely coincidental that the child happened to share his name, and me raised one eyebrow in a way that communicated clearly that she did not believe this for a single moment. James was an energetic and opinionated infant who grew into an energetic and opinionated toddler with me's dark eyes and Monroe's square jaw, and Caleb's immediate and enthusiastic approach to everything around him. The house that had been built for two was now full of four, which meant it was full in the way that good houses are meant to be full, with the noise and warmth and specific accumulation of a family's daily life. Caleb, at 8 and then 9, had grown into a boy who moved between the world of the homestead and his own interior world with an equal ease. He had Monroe's steadiness and me's directness, and something of his own that neither of them had given him, a particular quality of observation, of noticing things and sitting with the noticing before he spoke. Monroe had begun teaching him to ride properly in the fall of 1879, and by the spring of 1880 Caleb could handle a horse with a competence that made Monroe quietly proud. "He has your hands," me told Monroe one afternoon, watching from the porch as Monroe and Caleb worked a young horse in the yard. "For horses, the way you hold your hands. He has your patience for things he cares about," Monroe said. "We'll make him impossible between us," me said. "We already have," Monroe said, and she laughed. And the laugh was the warm, unguarded one she had that came all the way up from somewhere real. The homestead grew. The second summer they added a proper chicken house, and me's flock expanded from 6 birds to 15. The third summer Monroe built a second room onto the back of the house, which became the room Caleb had to himself, because James was by that point a talking tornado who needed his brother to have a door between them occasionally. The kitchen garden had expanded to a proper kitchen garden, and the kitchen shelves were full by fall with enough jars to make me run her hand along them sometimes with a quiet satisfaction that Monroe understood. The land had recovered completely from what the fire had taken. If you did not know where to look, you would not know there had been a fire. The grass grew over the burned earth, and the new structures were solid and true, and the garden was the kind of established garden that has had 2 years to decide where it wants to be and gone there. Thomas Ralston's grave on the eastern edge of the property had a proper headstone now, which Monroe had commissioned from a stone cutter in Wichita and driven back himself, and me had planted prairie flowers around it that came back every spring without being asked to. In the fall of 1880, with James walking and talking and Caleb turning 9, Monroe and me sat on their porch in the October evening, and Monroe told her something he had been holding since the first month. "I want to tell you something I've never told you," he said. She turned to look at him. "Is it bad?" "No," he said. "It's just something I knew early and didn't say because it wasn't the right time." "Tell me," she said. "When I first saw you at the edge of that burned ground," he said, "with your hands at your sides and Caleb behind you and you were about to fall, I don't mean you were weak. I want to say that clearly. You were the most not weak person I had ever seen. You were standing there holding yourself upright through what should have knocked anyone down, and it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen a person do." He paused, and I thought, I have to know this woman. Not save her, know her. That was the first thing, not help, not rescue, no. Me was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely name. Her eyes were bright. "And then Caleb put his hand in mine," Monroe said, "without being asked, and I thought, this is where I'm supposed to be." Me was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was steady in the particular way it was when she was feeling something large and keeping her voice level through a deliberate act. "I thought you were going to ride past," she said. "When I heard the hooves, I thought whatever was coming would just go past on the road and I would still be standing there. Then you rode up and got off your horse and you looked at me like I was a person and not a problem. Do you understand what I mean by that?" "I think so," he said. "Denton Price's man had looked at me like a problem," she said. "Something to be solved or removed. And you looked at me like a person who had something very hard happening to them, which is different." She took his hand. "That was the first thing I noticed, the way you looked at me." He squeezed her hand. "What was the second thing?" he asked, and she heard the slight smile in it. "Your horse," she said immediately. He laughed, genuinely surprised. "Tar. He stood so quietly," she said. "A nervous horse tells you a lot about a man. Tar stood like he trusted you." "I'll tell him you said that," Monroe said. "He'll be insufferable." She leaned against his side and his arm came around her, and the Kansas evening settled over them the way it always did, immense and particular and theirs. 2 years later, in the spring of 1882, they had their second child together. A girl this time, born in April with Monroe's gray eyes and me's dark hair, and an expression of profound thoughtfulness that she wore from the first day, and that made Caleb, at 11, say with certainty that she was going to be trouble in the best sense. They named her Ruth Elaine Kendrick, the second name for me's own middle name, which me had given her with a thoughtfulness that Monroe understood was about legacy and continuity, the quiet lines that connect women through time. Ruth was different from James the way people are simply different. Where James had been immediate and loud, Ruth was watchful and precise, and she observed the world with a gravity that charmed everyone who encountered her, and occasionally made Monroe feel that he was being assessed by someone much older than a 2-year-old. By 1882, the Kendrick homestead was prospering in the modest, real way that the word prospering was meant to be used, not wealthy, not opulent, but solid. The land was healthy. The livestock was healthy. The accounts were even and sometimes better than even. Monroe had built a reputation in the county for honest horsework and fair dealing, and me had built a reputation for excellent butter that had expanded its market to 3 establishments in Wichita through a trading arrangement. She had negotiated herself with a precision that made Aldrich Crane, who heard about it secondhand, remark that she ought to have been a lawyer. Harrow Creek had grown into something that was approaching a proper town, with a school that had been built the previous year by a community effort in which Monroe had been one of the primary contributors of labor. Caleb attended that school with a focus and enjoyment that gave me a particular satisfaction, because she had worried during the hard years about his education, about what the isolation of a single homestead was doing to his mind, and seeing him flourish in a classroom was the answer to a worry she had not even fully articulated. On a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1882, the whole Kendrick family rode into Harrow Creek for the 4th of July celebration, which had become a significant annual event with the town's growth. There was music from a fiddle and a banjo, and there was food, and there were races and games, and Caleb won the horse race for his age group on a small paint mare that Monroe had helped him train, coming across the finish line with his hat gone, and his face bright with the pure animal joy of speed. And me stood at the edge of the road, and cheered with the uninhibited fullness of a woman who has been too serious for too long, and has remembered recently that she doesn't have to be. Monroe held James on his shoulders so the boy could see over the crowd, and Ruth was in me's arms, and they watched Caleb receive his ribbon from the judge with the proud, helpless tenderness of parents watching a child accomplish something. And Monroe and me looked at each other over the top of Caleb's moment, and the look was too full to put into words, but neither of them needed words for it. In the evening, when the celebration was winding down and families were loading wagons and the stars were coming out, Monroe and me walked to the edge of the town where the road opened onto the plain, me carrying Ruth who had fallen asleep on her shoulder, and Monroe with James asleep against his chest, and Caleb walking between them in that easy way he had, half boy and half beginning to be something else. "Do you remember that first night at Harriet's?" me asked. "Every bit of it," Monroe said. "I was so frightened," she said. "I hadn't been frightened like that since Thomas died. Not frightened of you, I don't mean that, frightened of what was going to happen. Frightened that there wasn't a next thing." "There was always a next thing," Monroe said. "I know that now," she said. "Then it didn't feel like it." Caleb, who had been quietly absorbing this as he absorbed most things, said, "Monroe rode up before you could fall down. You told Aunt Clara that." Me looked at her son. "I did say that," she said. "He was riding to Wichita," Caleb said, with the factual certainty of a child who has heard a story enough times to know its details. "But he came down our road instead." "The Miller Road," Monroe said. "Yes." Caleb thought about this. "Do you think you would have fallen?" he asked his mother. Me considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I might have," she said. "But you didn't," Caleb said. "No," she said, "I didn't." "Because Monroe rode up," Caleb said, as if establishing a theorem. "Because Monroe rode up," me agreed. Caleb processed this with satisfaction as if it confirmed some principle he had been working on. "I'm going to teach James to ride properly," he said, moving on with the effortless topic transition of children. "Not just sitting, properly." "He's 3, me said. "He can start on tar," Caleb said, with the authority of someone who has thought this through. "Tar is very steady." Monroe looked at me over Caleb's head, and they were both trying not to laugh and not fully succeeding. And the sleeping weight of James against Monroe's chest shifted and settled. And Ruth made a small contented sound against me's shoulder. And the Kansas night was above them in all its impossible starlit fullness. And Monroe Kendrick thought that he had ridden a great many roads in his life and never known where any of them were going, and that this was the one thing that had finally taught him where he was going. Not because a road had led him here, but because a woman had been standing at the end of one with her hands empty, and her knees going soft and more courage than anyone he had ever known. He reached out in the dark and found me's hand, the warm, sure, familiar hand that had taken his that day outside the courthouse, and she folded her fingers through his without looking, the way people do when they are so accustomed to each other that the gesture requires no thought, only reflex, only the body's simple knowledge of where home is. They drove home in the wagon through the dark, Caleb up front with Monroe taking the reins, me in the bed of the wagon with the sleeping smaller children, and the sound of the horses' hooves on the road, and the whole enormous quiet dark plain around them going on forever. The homestead was lit by a single lamp in the window that Monroe had left burning. Me looked at it as the wagon came over the last rise, and the whole property spread out below them, the house and the barn and the fence lines and the garden plot, and the eastern edge where Thomas lay under the starlight. And she looked at it with the eyes of someone who has nearly lost a thing and knows in her bones what the having of it means. She had been a widow standing at the edge of a burned homestead with empty hands. She was now a woman with her hands full of children and work, and the daily accumulated substance of a life that had been rebuilt from its own ashes, and was continuing to grow. Monroe pulled the wagon to a stop by the barn and got down and helped Caleb down and then took James from me's arms while she climbed down herself, and they carried the sleeping children inside and put them in their beds with the practiced quiet of parents who have done this enough times to have it be a choreography. And then Monroe banked the kitchen fire for the night and checked the door and blew out the lamp, and me stood in the dark kitchen for a moment before they went upstairs. "Monroe," she said. "I'm here," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I wanted to say." He put his arm around her in the dark kitchen of the house they had built together on the land she had refused to give up, and she pressed into his side with the complete ease of a person who has found the place they fit. And for a long moment they simply stood there in the quiet dark with the sound of Kansas all around them, and the children sleeping above them, and the land stretching out in every direction, carrying all the weight of everything they had made. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the summer grass. the same wind that had blown the smoke of the fire and carried it away, the same wind that had ruffled Me's hair when Monroe had first ridden up, the same wind that was older than any of them and would outlast them all and yet moved through the lives of the people on the plain as if it knew each one by name. The lamp in the window had been blown out. The house was dark and full and sound. The grave on the eastern edge of the property was quiet under the stars, and the flowers that came back every spring without being asked to were dark now but present, rooted deep in the same soil as everything else that had been planted there. Thomas Ralston's land, me Ralston's land, me and Monroe Kendrick's land, Caleb's land, James's land, little Ruth's land who would grow into her gray eyes and her thoughtful look and one day ride a horse across these acres and breathe this particular air. Kansas in the summer of 1882 was not a gentle place. It was a place of drought and storm and hard winters, and the ongoing injustice of powerful men who tried to take what did not belong to them. And it was a place where the Homestead Acts had promised something that the powerful did their best to deny. And it was a place where women like me Ralston had to be harder than the ground and more enduring than fire just to hold what was theirs. None of that had changed. The fight for small homesteaders against the men who wanted their land was not over, would not be over for a long time, and there were other women standing at the edges of their own burned places with their own empty hands, and not all of them had someone ride up before they fell. But this particular woman had. This particular house was standing. This particular family was sleeping under one roof on land that they had defended and rebuilt and planted and harvested, and would continue to tend with all the fierce, ordinary love that people bring to the things they have chosen and kept. The Kansas stars turned overhead in their slow and ancient arc, the same stars that had been there before any of this and would be there after all of it, indifferent in the way large things are indifferent, but present, always present, spreading their cold light over the burned and the unburned alike, over the graves and the gardens, over the roads that led everywhere and nowhere. And sometimes, if a man was riding in the right direction on the right day, led him exactly to where he was supposed to be. Monroe Kendrick had been that man on that day. He had ridden up a particular road at a particular moment and seen a woman refusing to fall. And he had gotten off his horse, which was the simplest thing and also the thing that had changed every road that came after it. He had gotten off his horse and walked toward her and taken her arm and said, simply and truly, that it was all right not to be all right, and everything else had followed from that. All the work and the arguing and the laughter and the children and the porch evenings and the winter snowbound days and the summer mornings in the garden, and every ordinary and extraordinary moment that makes up the life of two people who have decided to be each other's ground. Me fell asleep that night with one hand on the pillow beside her where Monroe's head was, not touching him exactly but close enough to feel his warmth, the way she had come to sleep in the way of people who have been alone long enough that the nearness of another person still has a quality of wonder even after years. She slept deeply and without the particular watchfulness that had been her companion for 2.5 years after Thomas died, the light, anxious sleep of a woman who knew she was the only one between her children and whatever the night brought. She was not that woman anymore. The watching was shared now. The weight was shared. The morning would come and Monroe would be awake before her, already at the stove or already in the barn, already doing the first thing. And Caleb would come down next with his serious face still soft with sleep. And James would wake up loud and cheerful and demanding breakfast. And Ruth would stand in her crib and regard the morning with those gray eyes that missed nothing. The day would be full and the work would be real and the land would ask things of them as land always does. And they would give what was asked because that was the covenant, the old prairie covenant between people and earth. The promise that if you stayed and worked and did not give up, the earth would stay too and give what it had. Me knew what she had. She had counted it that first terrible day at the edge of the ruin $4.30, a horse and a wagon, a 6-year-old boy, the dress on her back. Empty hands, the kind of empty that feels absolute. And now her hands were full of the things that matter, of children and morning work and a man who looked at her like a person and whose horse stood still and who had never once, in all the time since that first day, made her feel that she was anything other than the most necessary person in his world. That was enough. That was everything. The wind moved through the summer grass. The house stood solid on its foundation. The stars burned on, and in the morning they would begin again.